Welcome to Ebru Africa this morning. I am Cheritage Kene. It is the 7th of April 2014. Here are some of the headlines making way across the African continent this hour.
Afghan historic elections. Shortage of ballot papers gets Afghanistan off guard amid violent threats by the Taliban. We resign. Mali's government resigns after just 6 months in office. The harmony of painting. Ghanaians paint Hollywood the African way in a quest to entice cinema goers. The Turkish Olympiad. Light Academy holds a Turkish language and cultural festival in readiness to represent Kenya in the 12th annual edition to be held in Turkey.
Now we begin things off in matters Afghan elections. Now outgoing President Hamid Karzai has praised the large voter turnout despite a threat by the violence by the Taliban and the poor weather experienced during the vote casting.
Afghanistan's outgoing President Hamid Karzai is praising the high turnout for Saturday's election. 7 million of the country's 12 million eligible voters headed to polling stations to vote for his successor in defiance of Taliban threats of violence. Karzai says it's a leap of progress.
ملت افغانستان امروز یک نمایش بزرگی.
The Afghan nation today has put in practice its dream to participate in voting, he says.
باران در خنک و با احتمالی که حملات تروریستی داشت.
Despite the cold and rainy weather and possibly terrorist attacks, our sisters and brothers nationwide embraced this election, and their participation is a step forward and a success for Afghanistan. It wasn't all smooth running, partly because organisers hadn't expected such a high turnout. Some polling centres ran short of ballot papers. The Independent Election Commission ordered an extension to voting hours to allow time for the documents to arrive. Security remained tight in Kabul on Sunday despite relief that attacks by Taliban fighters were fewer than anticipated. What violence did take place was on a far smaller scale than feared. It's expected to take about 6 weeks to gather in all the results from across Afghanistan's rugged terrain.
Still in Afghanistan, a landmark and historic general election has marred by shortage of ballot papers as organizers appeared unprepared for the high turnout. Here is a report on how the shortage of ballot papers left many voters still queuing to cast their vote as they waited for more ballots to be dispatched.
The voting in Afghanistan's landmark presidential election was largely peaceful. Only isolated incidents of violence at polling stations were reported. Taliban insurgents had vowed to derail the election. Instead, Saturday's voting was marred by something else.
I was waiting from 2 p.m., but the election workers told us that there are no more ballot papers. 3 other centers here have also run out.
Election officials were unprepared for the high turnout, nearly 60% of eligible voters. Polling stations simply ran out of paper ballots. More ballots were dispatched where they were needed, and some polling stations stayed open much longer than planned. Still, many voters stood for hours to cast their vote, leaving some frustrated over the wait.
I spent 2 hours waiting to vote, but now they are telling us the ballots are finished. How come the government is not providing enough paper ballots? What kind of law is this? This itself is a fraud.
It's unclear how widespread the shortage may have been. 15 million ballots were printed for a country of 12 million eligible voters. Afghan President Hamid Karzai praised the high turnout.
Despite the cold and rainy weather and possible terrorist attacks, our sisters and brothers nationwide embraced this election. Their participation is a step forward and a success for Afghanistan.
Afghanistan's rugged terrain makes it difficult to gather all of the ballot boxes and count the votes. It'll be 6 weeks before final results are announced.
Now, Mali's government has resigned, led by its premier, after less than 6 months in office. The town planning minister, Moussa Mara, will become the new prime minister, according to the presidential spokesman.
Outgoing Prime Minister Umar Tatam submitted the entire government's resignation to President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta on Saturday, and it was accepted. His replacement, Mara, a political veteran who ran against Keïta in Mali's August presidential election, will be responsible for appointing new ministers. No time frame was given for the appointments. Under the Malian system, a reshuffle is normal following legislative elections. President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta was elected on a pledge to unite Mali and is seeking to rebuild the country from the ashes of a war against militants. The West African country was plunged into chaos by a Tuareg rebellion in early 2012, followed shortly by a military coup. Militants took advantage of the chaos and seized the desert north, forcing France to intervene.
Now, Rwanda has made commendable steps in 20 years after the genocide that rocked the nation, the East African region, and the world in 1994. Now, however, the memory of the impact of the genocide is not too far from those who suffered from it. Families who lost loved ones are now struggling to look to the future.
20 years ago, Rwanda was torn apart as violence spread across the country with staggering speed and brutality. Ordinary Rwandans became killers and neighbors enemies. More than 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. Yet today, a handful of those victims and perpetrators live side by side in a small community known as the Reconciliation Village. The village is funded by the non-profit Christian organization Prison Fellowship International, providing homes in exchange for the reconciliation between two former enemies, both Hutu and Tutsi.
We helped each other bring water and mud to build new homes for ourselves. We didn't say this one is Hutu or this one is Tutsi.
During the genocide, members of Cecile's family were brutally killed with machetes, and she only managed to survive by fleeing into neighboring Burundi. Now, Cecile lives next door to one of the men responsible for the slaughter. Tried by Rwanda's traditional Gacaca courts, Frederick Kazigwemo had his sentence cut short after he confessed to killing 9 people, including members of Cecile's family.
Before I apologized, I didn't have peace in my heart. Sometimes when I was standing somewhere, I would see the faces of those I killed in my eyes. Now I don't see them anymore.
Since 1994, the Rwandan government has worked to build a common national identity.
They share the same culture, they share the same language, they share the same believing in God. So what Hutu, Tutsi and Twa have in common is much, much more than what can devise artificially them.
These children may share a yard and a future. But the Reconciliation Village is still an exception in Rwanda, where many remain haunted by the memory of the genocide.
Now haunted by guilt that they failed to prevent the Rwandan genocide, Western powers have long stood by President Paul Kagame, whose then rebel forces brought the killings to an end. But now, on the 20th anniversary of the massacre, they have begun to distance themselves from their former hero as evident mounts on new abuses by Kagame's own government.
There has been no breakdown in ties, but in different ways and at different speeds, Rwanda's allies across the world and in the United Nations have begun to adopt a tougher stance. Allegations of interference in the war-torn Democratic Republic of Congo and the assassination of regime critics have tainted Rwanda's reputation in spite of a successful recovery since the 1994 genocide. Foreign capitals that have always criticized Rwanda's unstable neighbors for rights abuses have long remained silent over Kagame's increasingly authoritarian rule. But international attitudes towards Rwanda and Kagame, the stern former Tutsi rebel who defeated the Hutu extremists behind the genocide, have begun to change. In January, Kagame refused to condemn the murder of his former intelligence chief turned regime critic Patrick Karegeya, feeding rumors he had ordered the killing. Rwanda's rapid economic recovery after the genocide had led to optimistic talk of it becoming a beacon of development. Kigali is often accused of being part of the trouble in DRC, where UN experts have gathered convincing evidence that Rwanda supports groups like M23 rebels. Countries like Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden froze aid in 2012, although Stockholm resumed assistance after giving a warning. Norway has reduced donations by 2/3 in recent years. Only Britain remains an uncritical ally, partly thanks to the influence of former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who acts as a special consultant to Kagame. The Rwandan genocide became a key impetus behind Blair's policy of humanitarian intervention after he came to office in 1997. On April 7, when Rwanda formally marks the anniversary genocide, London will be represented by Foreign Minister William Hague, while Washington will be represented by its UN Ambassador Samantha Power.
South Africa's platinum strike drags on for almost 3 months now. Now the miners and their families are battling to survive without pay. It is an irony that Mariacana's residents, who live in just meters away from the world's largest reserves of platinum, the metal used from everything from catalytic converters to jewelry.
Fighting off hunger. These are the families bearing the brunt of South Africa's mining strikes. Workers at the country's top 3 platinum producers down tools on the 23rd of January, making this the largest strike since the end of apartheid. At Maracana Mines informal settlement, Nomfanelo Jali is struggling to feed her family without her husband's income.
I'm 1 week. I spent the whole week without food in the house. But yesterday I went to collect my grant money and was able to buy groceries for my children.
Miners in the Platinum Belt have been calling for a doubling of their wage to $1,200 a month since August 2012, when 34 striking miners were shot dead by police. But during the standoff with the mining companies, they earn nothing and do nothing. Many of the men spend the little they have on cheap beer to stave off the boredom. With money so tight, Maracana's shops and businesses have been forced to sack workers or close down. The supermarket sells a tenth of the meat it used to, now mostly chicken heads and feet, the cheapest cuts available. Some miners have turned to moneylenders, taking out high-interest loans to make ends meet.
Really, I have never been to a place like this before, but if things are like this, we have now to make means of a living now. So that's why we're resorting to other things.
The crippling strike has cost workers almost $500 million in lost wages, and platinum companies Anglo-American, Implats and Lonmin $1 billion in lost revenue. It's also hit South Africa's GDP, damaging the country's already weakening rand. Yet so far the government-mediated talks between mine bosses and unions have failed to make headway.
This isn't a game who's going to win. This isn't a war, one side wins, the other loses. Both are losing here. I think this strike has to end a week after the elections.
Miners' families say they support the strike despite the hardship they're suffering. But companies warn that the industrial action will inevitably lead to job losses, even if a settlement is reached.
In matters Kenya, now Kenyan students from Light Academy held a final competition of the International Language and Culture Festival in Nairobi in readiness for the 12th International Turkish Olympiad.
Yüz boyası şamanizm. Şamanizm kültüründen gelen, şamanizm dininden gelen, yani ateşe tapanların bir şaman dansını yapacağız. O arkadaşımız Edward da o şaman dansını canlandıracak.
My name is Errol and I am going to dance today as a witch doctor in the Turkish culture, yes.
The International Language and Cultural Festival is a competition in which Turkish speakers from around the globe recite poetry, write essays and sing songs. The audience enjoyed poetry, songs and skits performed in Swahili and Turkish language during the event held at Light Academy in Nairobi.
I really enjoyed it, I learned a lot, and I'm really impressed by the kind of work that has gone into training the students. It's an excellent job.
What I have seen is wonderful. What the young ones have done is very good. That through this effort, we're able to bring people together.
Many praised the event, saying it was one way of uniting people across the world.
It is one way of showing that we are one world. It is one way of bringing people together. That through these cultural activities, we will then have only one world, all of us coming together.
The importance of it is it helps to bring societies and communities together, and also it takes the children out of class to find other life skills that they can develop, which is very, very critical for the workplace. Teamwork skills, cross-cultural communication, etc., which is very, very important.
Winners and runners-up will represent Kenya in the International Language and Cultural Olympiad to be held in Turkey in May this year.
We must emphasize the importance of culture. Every society has to be proud of its culture, cultural heritage. And what Right Academy has shown us is that we can all shine. Once we shine culturally, we can also shine academically.
Now, a Pakistani policeman has been suspended for bringing a case of attempted murder against a 9-month-old baby and forcing the crying toddler to appear in court. As incredible as it is, the 9-month-old boy appeared before a court in Pakistan to face the charges.
Musa Khan is 9 months old and charged with attempted murder. This was his first appearance before a court in Pakistan in relation to the charge. He's accused with other family members of stoning police and other officials during a raid on the area where he lived. The infant's grandfather says the whole situation is incredible. He was booked under Section 326 and was presented before a court. He says he doesn't even know how to pick up his milk bottle properly. How can he stone the police? Police charged the baby boy over the alleged incident that happened during a raid to disconnect gas supplies from homes where the bills had allegedly not been paid. An official complained that he'd been attacked by the whole family and suffered a head injury. It's not yet clear what Musa's plea will be to the charge, nor how he's likely to communicate it to his legal team.
Now, author Whitney Otto once said, "No one fights dirtier or more brutally than blood." Now, only family knows its own weaknesses and the exact placement of the heart. And Egypt has witnessed the gravity of such rage. A family feud resulted in the death of at least 23 people in the southern Egyptian city of Answa.
At least 23 people are now dead after violence erupted between rival families in Egypt's city of Aswan. It all started when students belonging to the families scrawled insulting graffiti on the walls of a local school. The Interior Ministry said the two sides used guns and petrol bombs. Several homes were burned to the ground before police were able to stop the clashes on the street. Security sources said reinforcements from the army were requested to prevent more bloodshed.
Now, art has always been subject to interpretation, and for Ghanaian artists, they have chosen to present the Hollywood blockbusters in an African perspective. Their unique take has led to a market for this art, with collectors parting with hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to own a coveted piece.
Oko Afutu knows exactly what will get people flocking into theatres to watch the British horror film Dog Soldiers. That's a poster showing a werewolf biting off a man's head. From his front porch in a suburb in Ghana's capital, Afutu spends his days painting garish movie posters for the films that show at movie theatres around Accra.
I love paint, especially action movies, like action movie. Because of action movie, inspired me more to do movie posters from 80s. I say action movie like Rambo, and also Schwarzenegger. The way they do the movie. Action movies, it's inspired me most.
Each poster Afutu paints earns him about $56, that's approximately 40 euros or 34 pounds. But outside Ghana, the idiosyncratic interpretations of Hollywood blockbusters by local artists like him are coveted by art collectors and can sell for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. The major appeal to them is a mystery, says Brian Chankin, who collects Ghanaian movie posters and displays them at his Chicago video rental store. The misspellings don't matter. The placement of the characters on the canvas is always a little bit awkward. It's all in the flavor, that's for sure. In his quest to entice cinema goers, Afutu spares no detail. If the movie is bloody, his posters will be bloody.
Sometimes you watch the movie, or if the movie you have seen, you can see the movie without a picture on the movie. Then we create our own style to make a poster.
The poster will attract them to go and watch the movie, said Afutu, who has been painting since 1988. The way they will think of the movie will be either a wicked or a hard movie.
That story wraps up the bulletin for now, but join me shortly as I take you through the social media.